we would like to speak first about the work that you have been doing with Enough on the non-governmental program to contain the flow of income from minerals, conflict minerals in eastern Congo. Um, I was pleased to receive a copy of the most recent paper that you and John Prendergast wrote about the conflict minerals. But what struck me about that was how much attention you paid to describing the actors. You were describing a kind of a value chain, but you really paid attention to who was doing what. How important is it for us to understand the background motivation of different actors in a conflict-affected situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for having me, Willeen, and I really appreciate the invitation to come down and also to the Institute for actually designing this course around economics and peace building. I think that it's absolutely a critical field, and those of us who are peace building practitioners end up spending 75 or 80% of our time on financial or economic issues in so many of these conflicts. And so I think it's really important that we spread knowledge about this issue. So first of all, thank you very much. In terms of Eastern Congo and trying to report on the situation and explain it, it's very interesting dynamics in that particular conflict. There you have conflict minerals, so tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, most of which go into our electronic products, so cell phones and laptops, eventually down the chain, and yet they're fueling violence out in Eastern Congo. Much like diamonds did in Sierra Leone and Angola, this is what's happening today in Eastern Congo. And so I and John traveled to Eastern Congo over the summer together with a television crew from 60 Minutes, and we looked at some of the various players in the chain, and so we said, well, we should really try to come back and explain this to interested folks here in the U.S. and Europe, because actually this directly or indirectly affects them through their consumer purchases of laptops and cell phones. And so a lot of people expressed interest to us to say, well, how exactly do the minerals come from Congo? What's the value chain there, and who are the different players along those steps? And so we just decided to go and elucidate each one of those and take photos and document them. And I traveled to mines, and so we found out that there are 6 actual steps in that supply chain. And it's not a murky trade. It's a fairly transparent trade, but unfortunately, it's still fueling conflict today. Well, Eastern Congo is such a tragedy because it's one of the most resource-rich areas of the world. They've got so much gold and so many of these minerals that are in vast abundance there. People said that essentially you could dig in your backyard and find these materials that are incredibly rare on the world market, and yet it's one of the poorest areas in all of Africa and all the world, really. Bukavu, which is a city that I went to, which is sort of the regional capital of that area, it was built for something like 500,000 people, and yet several million are living there now because of being displaced from the war. And essentially you have people who end up walking for tens and tens of miles every day to transport their goods on foot. You have no roads in the region. You have very poor water and sanitation facilities, and you have people living on less than $1 a day. It's very hard to actually conduct poverty surveys there because of the ongoing conflict. But essentially the poverty is very, very intense there, and the main reason is that the war is continuing. And the reason that the war is continuing, the main fuel is being provided by these minerals in which the armed groups control either the mines or the trading routes for those minerals.
But what's happened to agriculture? That was a very rich agricultural.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Eastern Congo is sort of the breadbasket of the entire region there. It's right on the equator. You can grow essentially anything, and yet the armed groups have taken over these areas and turned them into mines. or turned them into very insecure areas so that people are afraid to farm. And unfortunately, a lot of development agencies haven't invested back in agriculture yet in that area, though there's a heavy interest in it from the local population.
Now, you came away with a set of recommendations on what could be done to improve the situations. What were those recommendations?
Well, we think that because the minerals, the conflict minerals trade is such a driver of conflict over there, that we'd like to see some concrete action specifically targeting that, which can kind of act as a lever to help resolve the conflict overall. So what we'd like to see are different steps from the Obama administration. We'd like to see different steps from companies, and we'd like to see steps from legislators here as well. So overall, we'd like to see a trace audit certify regime, much like the Kimberley process for conflict diamonds, and kind of building on the lessons that we've learned from the Kimberley process. The Kimberley process isn't perfect, but certainly it has made it a lot more difficult for rebel groups and militias to trade diamonds for guns overall, and yet we have nothing like that for these 3T and gold minerals. So we'd like to see that and some kind of major certification regime. From the administration and Congress, we'd like to see some regulations on companies, and luckily Congress is already working on some tracing legislation and auditing legislation, which would be very helpful, seeing as a lot of the end consumer or the end user companies are actually based here in the United States, or they're listed on our stock exchanges even if they're foreign companies. So in that sense, the United States can actually have a pretty concrete role. And we'd like to see further action from the administration on helping secure the mines, on developing livelihood initiatives, as you mentioned, with agriculture, for former miners and their communities. We think that there's a lot of room for policy action which can help drive an end to the conflict.
Did you have a sense that you really needed to be there to come up with those recommendations? Were there insights that you gained from actually being in the Eastern Congo, or were you able to take the Kimberley process and roll it out for the Congo?
Absolutely. It was critical that I go out there, and I would encourage anyone else very interested in this trade to do the same. It's an area where not a lot of reporters get to. There's only one full-time U.S. reporter who's based in Congo, and he's completely on the other side in Kinshasa. And so you often don't get to hear the individual stories of people affected by this conflict, whether they be women who were sexually abused, which is the main weapon of war that a lot of these militias use, or the minerals traders or the government inspectors who are in charge of actually controlling some of this trade. I mean, for example, we sat in a minerals dealership, and up to that point, various electronics companies had been telling us, oh, well, the minerals trade is so complicated, we have absolutely no way of being able to trace these minerals. And so we decided to go to Eastern Congo and find out for ourselves. And at this minerals dealership, this dealer told us, he's point blank, he said, oh yes, we know exactly where this sack comes from, and this sack comes from, and this sack comes from. And I said, well, really show me. And he poured out the rocks onto this table and poured out the other rocks from the other sack. And he said, look, you see these look different, and these come from this particular area. This is a rebel-controlled mine. He told us right then and there. And a government inspector backed this up, and then they said, yeah, well, these are from a government-controlled mine on this side. And sure enough, they look different. So getting on the ground was very helpful.